what is the cost of having a culture of uninitiated?
Oh my God. Well, you can look at pretty much any problem we're facing in the world today in some way, trace it back to the uninitiated individuals who are largely in power across the planet and are making these decisions.
Maybe a good place to start is like, very simply put, what is a rite of passage?
Yeah, well, a rite of passage is basically a community created ritual or series of rituals that basically help a given individual transition from one life phase into another. And if you break down the normal human lifespan, you could argue there's at least 6, 7, 8 natural rites of passage: birth into childhood, childhood into puberty, puberty into adolescence, adolescence into young adulthood into middle age, often accomplished by being a parent and having children, middle age into eldership, eldership into death. All of these are rites of passage where symbolically we have to die to the former self, the former identity that we had, and be, again, symbolically reborn into some new sense of who I am and what I'm now here to do with this part of my life.
Wonderful. So you mentioned this word initiation in that, right? And I'm just wondering, that has a lot of different connotations and a lot of different applications. I'm wondering for you, in the context of rites of passage, what's the role of initiation? And maybe you could also just, again, at laying the ground here, define initiation a bit. Help us understand, what do we mean when we say initiation?
Well, it's a really good question. I'll start by saying that we commonly misuse and misunderstand the term rites of passage
Okay.
because we have these commonly held cultural definitions for these terms. And typically, what that connotes to most people are what I would call dysfunctional or unconscious rites of passage. So let's focus just on one, from adolescence into young adulthood. So for many people, they consider, having your first sexual experience a rite of passage.
Mhm.
They say, oh, having your first drink is a rite of passage. Learning to drive the car, getting to vote, uh, or getting married, even. So all of these things, can be part of a rite of passage, but only if they're actually called out and consciously celebrated and consecrated by elders in community. So if there are not a number of ideally public rituals where the community gathers to name the process, what's going on right now with this young person, then that the potential impact of a real rite of passage will be lost. It will not have its truly transformational meaning and intent. So is that clear? Is that
Yeah, yeah, sure. I think also maybe just layering in this concept of the hero's journey, right? In any sort of initiation, there's you write about this in your book, Rites to a Good Life. It's wonderful. I recommend actually to our listeners who already appreciate the audio format, get this on Audible. It's incredible. Frederick has taken clips from his various interviews over the years with just the luminaries around this field of rites of passage and use the direct quotes from his films in the audio format. So it's unlike most books you will download on Audible, where you're actually getting. It's much more like an audio documentary. It's brilliant. Highly recommend it. And in this, you talk a lot about Joseph Campbell's hero's journey model, right? The 3 steps. Can you walk us through what those 3 steps are and how they fit into this idea of initiation?
Yeah, well, and you can, the term was first coined, we should mention, I can't remember now if it was 1908 or 1912, but a book by Carl van Gennep called Rites of Passage. He had done a lot of research, cross-cultural anthropological research, to look at these various rites of passage around the world. And so he boiled it down to 3 basic ingredients. Now, depending on who you talk to, there can be many more, 5, 6, 7, whatever. But I like to keep things simple. And for me, the 3 basic ingredients are separation, ordeal, and return. And each of those three archetypal phases of initiation can be called by many names. So separation and typically means separating from our daily lives. So we have to basically get outside of the everyday in order to be able to experience something of who we are at root, our fundamental essence. So we have to let go of all of our ego identification tools and surroundings. So that means everything from, of course, starting with the most obvious, cell phones, computers, and the like. But even, the foods we eat, the times that we get up, and not to mention the activities that we do in a given day. And ideally, physically be removed from our daily surroundings into an unfamiliar, ideally also setting in nature, out in the real world, where we can also, part of the journey should be basically reuniting, reacquainting ourselves not only with our deepest human nature, but with the nature of this mother planet, right? So, of the life that sustains all of us. So, anyway, so that's separation. You've got to be totally, and it impacts time, our sense of time, because you have to be separated from Chronos time, 24 hours in a day, 365 days a year, into some new form of time. Fortunately, the Greeks had a word for this too, kairos, which means sacred or cosmic time, which is the time that it takes for a star to die, the time that it takes for the leaves to appear in the spring, right? So, or times that we can be familiar with through experiences with psychedelics, for example. So anyway, so we enter into this new frame of time, and that's the middle stage, the ordeal, the liminal phase, the threshold phase, some call it. And in that phase, where we've now separated from our everyday lifestyles and habits, we are kind of back to basics, to just who we are as a human being, thinking, feeling, sensing. And we have to be given a challenge. And that challenge can take a million different forms. But, typically among African tribes in the bygone era, it could be putting a spear in the hand of a young man and saying, go out and kill a lion. And you can imagine what kind of a challenge that would be, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
and in fact, there were many young men who would not survive given initiations, given these rites of passage. And this was assumed on the part of the community traditionally to be actually a kind of a silver lining to the cloud, an unspoken blessing, that there might have been something that person was carrying that might have been harmful in future to the community. So at any rate, you're in this liminal phase, you're in this ordeal, you have to accomplish this seemingly impossible task. And then in the final stage, then is homecoming, is return. So you have to come back and be reintegrated with the community, but you have to bring the blessings of what it is that you've experienced. And it takes the wisdom of elders to help you derive what those blessings might be. So you come back traditionally and you tell your story. This is what happened to me. And every aspect of that story becomes an archetypal signifier of the journey that you've been on. So there are no irrelevant pieces of data to that journey. It's all significant. It's all part of the new identity that you will be born into. So that's what the community and the elders do. They help you figure out, who is this new person and what gifts do they bring to the community? So that's when they're giving new names. That's when they're often given new physical signifiers like tattoos or scars to indicate that they are no longer that child, that adolescent they used to be, and they're now an adult with all the rights and responsibilities of all of the adults in the community, bearing particular gifts for that community so that they know exactly how they fit in.
Wonderful. So we live in an era where these rites of passage have been in many communities forgotten. They've been pushed aside. We have a culture of uninitiated leaders, and that has had a cost. In your book, you write about this, like the thread of time, or there's like a continuity that's been lost, right? It's a bit of a chicken and egg thing where we don't have a community of initiated to welcome the initiated back in. So we're having to reintroduce these rites of passage. And I think it's helpful, first of all, before we go too deep into this, just to lay out like what is the cost of having a culture of uninitiated.
Oh my
Like,
God. Well, you can look at pretty much any problem we're facing in the world today, and
mhm,
in some way uh, uh, trace it back to the uninitiated individuals who are largely in power across the planet and are making these decisions. So, just to break it down, so why is there no international collective action on climate change? Well,
mm,
because there's a number of individuals who are stuck in what I call suspended adolescence. They may be 60, 70, 80 years old, but they're living in shadow. They're still in that adolescent identity of me, mine, right? And they're not living in that adult world of us together, right? And so they're grabbing all the spoils they can. So it doesn't matter if they're still, making billions off carbon extraction. They don't give a shit what it means to the planet. Okay. And then, the same is true in the political sphere, right? We're seeing, in a sense, a regression of what I would call mature masculinity in the field of politics. And it's all about suspended adolescence. Let me grab whatever power I can in whatever way I can for me. There's no servant leadership enacted really in the world. So, at any rate, the
mhm.
implications of this are everywhere and enormous.
Yeah, and we see it collectively in our culture, right? The uninitiated leaders. We also these ceremonial rites of passage have been around for so long, millennia, right? And in some ways, maybe they're just hardwired into us.
I think they are.
Yeah, there's research on, what ceremony and ritual does to the human brain and the need for it and what centers of the brain it lights up. In some ways we are wired for it. And so we find ourselves, many of us in the culture, maybe most, are looking for these rites of passage, the demarcation from childhood to adulthood. And it manifests in other forms, right? Whether it be violence or greed. I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about the personal, that this part about how it's missing on an individual level as well, and how individuals are seeking it out at a young age.
Well, yeah. I mean, there have been books written, I think, with the very name called The Fatherless Society,
Hmm.
right? And so many of our fathers, in particular, and not only fathers, certainly, but in the case of men, it carries a special significance, certainly, to not have fathers in our lives blessing us. In fact, Robert Bly said, so much of the American male can be explained by their unconscious desire to reach out for their father's blessing, right?
Mm.
And the last few presidents of the United States, particularly Trump and Bush, come right to mind looking for dad's blessing in everything that they're doing unconsciously. So, uh, what does this mean, for the individual? Well, if we don't come together as a community and basically consecrate these passages when they appear, it can create all kinds of problems because then people start unconsciously acting them out. And the way that they unconsciously act them out is through these trials, these ordeals that
Hmm.
they come together as peers to create for themselves that are, in a sense, they're- in some ways, they're not bad trials. They're not bad in and of themselves. I mean, take for example, hey, six friends sitting around. I wonder if we can drink, two six packs and drive 100 miles an hour down this neighborhood street. So the point of elders is to make these things safer, right? So that people do not ultimately have to risk their lives and risk the lives of others in order to prove the capacity of their own bodies and the capacities of their own human reach, right? So and it gets really problematic to some degree in gangs. So you can understand the function of gangs is actually a very healthy one in many ways. It's very wholesome and good. And it makes a lot of sense for a lot of young people, not only urban young people, but wherever they find themselves, who've been abandoned by their elders, who've been abandoned by their parents, to find peers to form family units with, to bond, to create community. The problem comes when the tests, the trials that they have to go through in order to become accepted members in that community involve violence, violence either to themselves or other people. And it can be, the trial to, and for some gangs, go out and shoot somebody, kill somebody. In fact, what happened to my neighbor in Oakland a couple of years ago, I believe, was exactly that kind of rite of passage for a young man who ended up walking into our driveway, hitting her, pulling her out of her car that was running, and getting in the car and stealing it. And he was just a kid, I don't think he was more than 17 years old. And he did it without a weapon. And that is part of the trial that was put before him, something like that. So at any rate, we have these dysfunctional modes of initiation that all it takes is eldership and guidance to actually make them functional and pro-social.